Welcome to part 9 in our series of presentations looking at the Genesis story. I've entitled this The New Start, and we're going to look at the end of chapter 8 well through chapter 11 in the book of Genesis. Let's just reflect back on the previous presentation. Noah has emerged from the ark with his family, the flood having subsided, and this is the start of a new era. There is hope. A new beginning. We saw in Genesis, the author has described God creating. And then as a result of our endless rebellion and the total corruption of humanity, there's a process of decreation. Now we're moving into the process of recreation in the life and family of Noah and his descendants. And I pointed out that picture is a picture that underpins ideas that we find in the New Testament of the need for our lives to be decreated before they're recreated and the image and likeness of God restored upon us. Because that's what God has given to mankind. We are not animals that simply work by instincts. God has breathed into us and created in us something of his image and likeness. We have the capacity to do what God does in his creativity. We have the capacity to be as God is in our spiritual awareness. We are aware of that which is beyond ourselves. Now in Noah, there's a chance to start again in recreation, moving into a life of hope and purpose. The book of Genesis is set in that area of the world. That was the world that was the world of the people of that time. The basin of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. That was the world of Noah. And the ark, which was just a box, had drifted north, eventually as the flood subsided to settle on the mountain range, the hills, perhaps the foothills of the Ararat area towards the north. I put in two towns that will turn out to be very important in later presentations. Communities that were established at a later point. The total depravity and the flood followed. And we saw this interesting picture where the word for corruption is the same word as the word for destruction. And the principle that corruption ultimately and inevitably leads to destruction. That is always the way in life. Corruption will be followed by destruction. And in this case, it was a flood. Now let's move forward into the story. Here we have Noah and his family having emerged from the ark. They've been there for a year. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord, and taking some of all the clean animals and clean birds, he sacrificed burnt offerings on it. The Lord smelled the pleasing aroma and said in his heart, "Never again will I curse the ground because of humans, even though every inclination of the human heart is evil from childhood. And never again will I destroy all living creatures as I have done. As long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night, will never cease." And indeed, it never has ceased. The word there, Yahweh. The self-existent God, the God of relationship. Pleasing aroma, it's almost as if God has been pictured as a human being here. No, behind the scenes, the author has chosen some very clever words. And the word for pleasing is a word that just sounds like Noah. He's playing with words. He's pleased with what Noah has done. A sacrifice of gratitude. They had been preserved through the flood. They'd emerged at the far end, intact. Gratitude shows. The word for curse there is holding in contempt. You have to watch in the Bible, because the word in English curse, there are a number of words in the original language which have a variation in meaning. Difficult to translate, but that means hold in contempt. We don't deserve it. What a picture. We're evil from childhood. As soon as we've got the ability to take our own decisions, we tend to rebel. We don't deserve it. But God has created a covenant with mankind. He will look after us. He will preserve us. His interest, his agenda is the best for us. There's a very clever set of elements in this story, a lot of parallels. Again, the author has played with language with great skill. Twice, that's the purpose. Be fruitful and increase. Increase in number, fill the earth. The mastery over all the animals, all the creatures. They are our responsibility. They're given for us. We're responsible for them. We have control over them. The animals and the plants are given for our food. But life is sacrosanct. We don't just kill animals for the sake of killing animals, for food is one thing. But we certainly don't kill other human beings. Whoever sheds human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed. Human life is sacrosanct because that is true. We were made in the image and likeness of God. And when a human being kills another human being, we are destroying someone made in the image and likeness of God. That is serious. And down through societies, laws have been built in over deliberate murder. That's the kind of commission that God has given to Noah. He's got a start, a fresh start. Be fruitful, be successful. You've got food, you've got animals, you've got plants. Be successful, increase, multiply. Go ahead. But life is sacrosanct. God made a promise with humanity. No more mass flooding causing total destruction. The bow, it's the same word in the Hebrew for rainbow. It's an interesting thing. Now we understand the physics of this. The sunlight refracted through the raindrops. The colours that are part of white light are split, and we can see them as separate colours. The rain brings the flood. The sunlight brings us the hope. And the sun is refracted through the raindrops, the reminder of the hope, the certainty, the covenant. God will preserve life. God will look after us, all humanity. The word covenant occurs again and again. And again, the writer has created this pattern. He's so good at creating patterns with language and patterns with numbers. Confirm the covenant, starts it and finishes it. He confirms it. The sign of the covenant in the pink, the rainbow. The covenants for all generations to come. Verse 16, the eternal covenant. This isn't just temporary for Noah and his family. This is for all humanity forever. And then what is the sign of the covenant? My bow, the rainbow. Same word in the Hebrew. He's playing with language. And again, this is so typical of how he wrote, because when people couldn't read or write, the stories would be told. And by building in these clever patterns of language, it's much easier to remember and keep the story right. Yes, Noah expressed his gratitude on behalf of himself and his family because he sacrificed some animals and birds that were described as clean. He was told to take in 7 of the clean animals and birds, not just a pair. Now, this is the first time that building an altar is actually recorded. And it's written looking back, and it almost seems to understand the kind of ideas of altar building and clean animals and birds, which is part of the book of Leviticus. You see, it reflects future practice. The writer knows about the future practice because that's where he's living. The time of living, 2nd millennium BC. God's instructions about clean animals and birds and sacrifice. Probably the idea of clean animals and birds relates to food hygiene. People have put up all sorts of speculations about why certain animals are listed in Leviticus as clean and others are listed as unclean. Clean animals and birds, they could be used for sacrifice. Clean animals and birds could be used for food. And some animals and birds were not allowed to be used for either. Now, those who know about such things are aware that in the days when cooking and hygiene and food preparation was relatively primitive, many of the unclean animals and birds did carry diseases which could threaten human life. So it is probable that it relates to food hygiene, these laws, but we can't be certain. But the writer is reflecting into this story later instructions and directions. One thing that's made very clear in Genesis' story is that all life was created by God. It is all good. And the idea of clean animals and birds was to do with the sacrificial system, and it was also to do with diet. But if we look at Acts chapter 10, we can see God revealing to Peter in a dream that all life is clean. All created by him. He made it good. Things had moved on. And the food hygiene laws and principles of the 2nd millennium BC have moved forward into all life created. It's all good. God made everything good for us. Now we come to a very strange story. Let me just give you a quick overview of it. Noah grows some vines. He drinks too much. He ends up lying naked inside his tent. He's semi-conscious. Ham, one of his sons, saw his father's nakedness. He tells his brothers, and the brothers proceed to cover him up. He awakes from his drunken stupor. He's furious with Ham, and he curses him roundly. This is a strange story. Let's see if we can make any sense of it. It's worth noting that these are the only words recorded that Noah actually spoke. Now, that's a sad thought. The only words that are recorded of him were him cursing his son, and indeed his grandson particularly. Noah, who lived a life of faith. Faith meant that he took God at his word and got on with it. Noah is pictured as this great man, and the writer to the Hebrews pictures him as one of the great list of people, men of great faith who'd lived in the past. And yet the only words he spoke were a curse against his son and against one of his grandsons. We have to note the Bible does not condemn drink or alcohol. Everything made by God is good, but it does condemn drunkenness. Now, that doesn't mean to say that it gives us a kind of permission to take alcohol, because medically there's a significant minority of the population for whom some kind of addiction to alcohol is almost inevitable if we start taking it. But the Bible doesn't deal with that. It doesn't understand that. It accepts that alcohol is there, and what alcohol could do was that alcohol in wine preserved the wine so it didn't go off. Bacteria can't exist in alcoholic solutions and cause decay corruption and potential poisoning. So it is a preservative, like salt and sugar are. Eat too much salt, it hurts us. Eat too much sugar, it hurts us. Take too much alcohol, it hurts us. Drunkenness is certainly condemned. But many have suggested there's something more serious underpinning the story, but nobody really knows what it is. When he curses his son, he actually addresses the curse to his son's son, perhaps the youngest son, a man called Canaan. Now, it doesn't seem to make sense why is Canaan suddenly introduced in the story at this point. I'm going to suggest an interpretation which may help us to look at this. But first, let's stop and look at the word curse. A curse is simply words carrying spiritual power, often spoken by an authority figure. Here, the father and grandfather of the family. Here, the words were spoken in a drunken stupor. And I think that's the clue. And these words were fulfilled in later history in a pretty awful way. Canaan gave his name to the people who lived in the land of Canaan, a land that was overrun by the Israel people escaping from Egypt centuries later. And a people group who had turned to the most evil and horrendous of practices, including child sacrifice. The curse was fulfilled. Now, I sense that some of you find this idea of a curse a little bit hard to take. And in these series of presentations, I carefully avoid drawing in things from my own experience and try to be as objective as I can. But let me just refer to a little bit of experience. I have seen on many occasions people who've come to me whose lives have been blighted, who just can't seem to break through to success, who find there's something that blocks them, something that makes life impossible, something that holds them back, like a long shadow from the past. And when the curse has been broken, a curse spoken by an authority figure in their past, they've been set free, liberated, gloriously liberated. This is real. This is not theoretical. This is something that still happens. The words are often spoken by somebody in authority. Sometimes it's a school teacher, well-meaning perhaps, saying, "Come on, you'll never make anything of this. You'll never make anything of life." Trying to encourage a school pupil to try harder. But these words give permission for Satan to make sure that that person doesn't make anything of life, and they don't. It sometimes can be spoken by a leader in a church. I've seen this happen so often. We fall out, and the leader speaks words over us. "You're going the wrong way. God will never bless you." That's just permission for Satan to have a go at the person, and God doesn't bless them because Satan's got control of it. They're held back. And sometimes it comes from a father, and that's the picture here. A father and grandfather spoke these words. Now, I don't think this story speaks of something that's rational. We've looked for rational explanations. I don't think there are rational explanations. I think what's being shown here is simply that if we abuse alcohol, we can say things, and that may seem to be unimportant, but sometimes what we say is releasing Satan and giving Satan permission, as it were, to have a go at somebody. Words spoken in a drunken stupor. Words that were fulfilled in later history. There's power in a curse. A whole chapter in Deuteronomy is devoted to this topic. Blessings and curses. But if you look at the section on curses, it's several times the length of the section on blessings. The author is well aware of the power of the spoken word to invite Satan and his demons to cause us hassle and hold us back. This is real. And here are words spoken in a drunken stupor, and they came to a dreadful fulfillment in a people group that did the most horrendous things. Now that's all sounding bad, but that's the good news. Jesus can reverse the power of the curse. And when I've seen people set free, they've been set free by the power of Jesus. He has released them and broken the power of the curse because of what he did in his life, death and resurrection. And I've seen people gloriously released from something that's just simply holding them down, holding them back. Jesus can reverse the power of the curse. Now, I can't go any further on this because time prevents it, but this is a huge topic in its own right. And it may be that you're conscious in your life of something of this. It's worth seeking it out, seeking help from someone who's spiritually sensitive, and allow Jesus to reverse the power of the curse that's holding you back and releasing you to a great future. A future of hope was for Noah. He messed up by his drunken stupidity. A family line. Very strange why the writer to Genesis spends so much time giving family lines, and is listed in words, and I find these difficult to follow, so I put it in a kind of picture like this. Now, names are mentioned all over the place, but again and again, the focus is on the line that's important to the author, and I made that slightly bigger print, and it's coloured in the yellow. Noah through one son, through one grandson, and it moves on. Now, it's not necessarily father to grandfather to great-grandfather. They can have gaps in it. It's a pattern. But the key thing was the author wanted to get to Abram. He is the key figure. He is the figure that's key in God's purposes in the world. And you can see Abraham there, son of Terah. And why Abraham kind of adopted his nephew Lot, because Haran the father had died. And you may remember the story of Abraham going around with his nephew Lot and Lot's wife. And that's why that relationship was established. And it gets through to Jacob, whom God renamed Israel, from which the nation got its name. Now, the important principle in Genesis is that the less important family lines are listed first. Have a look at the text, you'll see it. Then it gives the important family line in more detail, and it just ignores the less important ones because it's going back to the important line. You can see at the top of the page, Joktan had 13 sons. They're all named, then they're ignored, because the key line didn't go down through Joktan, it went down through Peleg. The lines are selective. You can't assume that it's just father to son. They're descendants. That's the way they thought at that time. That's the way it worked. Now, the sons of Noah. And if you look at their descendants, very roughly, don't take this too accurately, but very roughly, the people groups in these areas were descended from these three sons. Now remember, Shem was the critically important one, sandwiched in the middle. Again, we're back to the Mesopotamian basin, the river basin, where the book of Genesis is centred at this time. Japheth tends to fade out of history in the book of Genesis. But Ham, cursed by his father Noah, the grandson Canaan, who gave his name to the land of Canaan, his descendants feature to some extent. What the author is interested in is the common origins coming from Noah, but the focus is on Shem, and the focus is on the area of Mesopotamia. That is the world of Shem, the world of Noah, the world of the author. Now, another strange story. We notice the Tower of Babel. Let's go back to our map. Remember, the ark was a box and it floated north and had settled in the hills of Ararat when the water had started to decline. And then there's a migration slowly towards the east, moving south, down the fertile valley area, and settlements grew and developed over long periods of time. Now, this story illustrates the clash between the Mesopotamian cultures that were developing and the world of Genesis, the world of the author, the world of God's revelation to the author of Genesis. And the Tower of Babel is a story that has to be understood in the context of that clash. Two different ways of thinking, two paradigms of thought. And let's just put them side by side. The world at that time, it had a rather positive view of humanity. But the world of Genesis was realistic. Human beings are rebellious. It doesn't change. It's made very clear when God renews the covenant with Noah. They saw their culture superior. Now, the book of Genesis doesn't view any culture as superior or favourable. They saw their culture taking over. It doesn't see that in Genesis at all. Culture is neutral. It's not part of it. It's rebellion and obedience that are the key elements, not culture. Now, as you look at this story, you can see so much of this repeating itself today. People view humanity as improving. They think of their culture as superior. They think of their culture taking over. Oh, the history of colonization of the 17th, 18th and 19th and early 20th century. But we see the same kind of cultural superiority now coming out of the Islamic world, seeing its culture as superior and deliberately planning to take over the West. But you see, it was human-centered. Whereas the book of Genesis looks at things from a God perspective. It puts words in God's mouth. And that's just a way of talking and revealing things at the time. It sees things from God's perspective. That is the revelation, insight the author has been given. They saw temples copying heavenly temples. They saw what they did here is just a copy of what existed in heaven. Their concept of heaven was different. Whereas the book of Genesis just talked about fancy brickwork. It's a human creation, and perhaps a measure of arrogance and folly. There isn't stone in the Mesopotamian Valley, so building was difficult. But they mastered the idea of making bricks, and showing their new technological skill, they could build big things. And they had the picture that the temples they built to their gods went down into the netherworld. They didn't really have a concept of heaven or hell, a netherworld, the world under the world. But they reached up to heaven. Laughable. But that's the way they thought. And to be honest, many of us today haven't got much beyond that, only we put it in more sophisticated language. God saw things in a much more spiritual way. The book of Genesis sees it that way. God is beyond that, beyond this world. This world is just his creation. He's much bigger than this world. He's the sovereign creator of the universe. He's a spiritual being. You see, there's a clash of two cultures there, and we're seeing clashes of cultures today, very vividly in the West. Now, this story is a beautiful piece of literature. Like so often, the writer has played with words, played with ideas, structured it, patterns, all built into it. Let me just give you one example. The patterns. One language, one people. One kind of speech, one language. The word there. Each other. Building the city. Name. Scattering. And ideas that are there as human creations of arrogance. In the second half, each of them is taken turn and demolished by God's activity. There's a great depth to this story, a great subtlety to this story, and a deep meaning for us today in this apparently strange story. Because this is what we humans tend to do. We so often create buildings. They're statements about us. They're statements about our status. We may build a house for ourselves. Or we make alterations to the house as a statement of our status as we see ourselves, our wealth, our culture, and our religion. Oh, we've seen this down through the years. If you look throughout much of Western culture, you will see the magnificent church buildings made of stone. Many of them made in the 19th century, built then. They were statements of wealth, success. Trade had brought wealth, status, our culture, the superiority of our religion. You can look at some of the dedications of some of these buildings, and often they're dedicated in the memory of some great benefactor, and then as a footnote, unto the glory of God. Why do they have steeples? Because they are standing out amongst the rest of the buildings. They are making a statement about how people saw God. Now that isn't necessarily all bad. But the best statement we can make about God is when we live lives that reflect his nature, which is love. And that's nothing to do with creating buildings. Now you see exactly the same happening with mosque building today. The Islamic communities are often seeking permission to put up mosques which are absolutely enormous. They're funded by oil wealth from the Middle East, and they want them to out-top every building in Western culture. They're making a statement about status, wealth, culture, but most important, a statement that their religion is superior. We all do this. You know what God does? That's what he thinks about it all. You can make the most magnificent home that you build for yourself. You can put in the most sophisticated things inside it. You don't last forever. You pass from this mortal world. What does it say? Palaces, churches, mosques, great buildings, great public buildings. Now we need these things. They can have their use and their purposes. They can bring benefits to society. But as creations to present status, wealth, culture, and religion, God flicks his fingers. As he did with the Tower of Babel, laughs at it. Human arrogance and folly. You see, we humans were created to manage God's world. We have perverted our great creative capacity because we are very creative. History of the world shows it. We reflect God's nature, but it's misdirected. And in essence, we're glorifying humanity. And even the great churches and mosques that you see, the church of the 19th century, the mosques of the 20th and 21st, basically, they're glorifying humanity. They're glorifying the builders, the architects, the designers. They're making statements of we are superior. And it's covered up in a veneer of religion. They're just repeats of the Tower of Babel. This is sadly true. Our creative skills are often perverted to expressions of our power and status. And then sometimes we use these against other people. To put down other groups, to make them seem to be inferior. And in doing this, we're undermining God as our creator. We reflect him. He is the great creator. We have creative skills made in his image. And very often we're damaging God's world. We're using resources that don't need to be used. In a world of limited resources, expressions of our power and status have very often damaged God's world. But they very often damaged other people. Because you see, when we see ourselves as superior, when we see our religion as superior, it's just one step on to put others down. And our respect for others. They are inferior. They're not one of us. They don't have it. They won't get to paradise. And others get put down. And our creative skills by this chain of events is destroying others. And I look out in the world today and I see that pattern happening again and again and again. Creative skills perverted from why God gave them, putting us up and our status up, and in the process putting others down, often very damagingly and severely. Noah's story. Here was a man who followed God's instructions, followed them to the letter. Wonderful. Who expressed his gratitude on behalf of himself and his family, having been rescued from the flood. Wonderful. But he compromised with alcohol and in a drunken stupor cursed his grandson. And that curse came true. And endless problems arose from it, and so many people suffered because of it. There is a warning here for us. Watch what we say, particularly if you're in a position of authority and power. Your words carry power, for good or for ill. And you can pronounce great blessings, or you can release the power of Satan, often without being aware of it, with terrible consequences. For Noah, faith meant obedience. He walked in the way of obedience. But God's great gift of the fruit, the grape, and our rebellion and stupidity, we misused it. And the consequences were not good. Essentially, God was directing Noah, and Noah built to God's design. And as a result, he saved his family, and from his family, people groups spread throughout the area. Then the story of Babel. Here is an abuse of human creativity, aimed at glorifying humanity, an expression of human arrogance. And that was not building to God's design. And there's an interesting kind of contrast between the two stories. The greatness of Noah, marred by the tragedy of his drunken stupor. But he did build to God's design, and his family was saved, rescued from the flood. And the story of the communities of the Mesopotamian area, not building to God's design, building to express their own glorification. And it all had consequences when it all fell apart, that they were scattered, their unity was gone. That's the contrast painted in this section of the book of Genesis. In the next presentation, we're going to look at chapters 11 onwards, and we're going to begin to look at the life of the great man, Abram.